Okay.
Hello.
How are you? So Bruce, start with Davenport?
Oh, I have a community meeting in Heritage this evening. I have to check.
The CIP and yeah. Okay.
Well, they're divided. And part
Good.
of that is my work, part of it's Rhonda's.
Okay. Call this meeting of the Finance Committee to order. I apologize for starting a few minutes late. Thank you for being here. The agenda today, for the benefit of my colleagues and staff, is basically a presentation on sort of debt review from our consultants Davenport, and then moving into a conversation on the capital budget and sort of the big picture items, as well as sort of drilling down maybe some questions about projects if people have them, but trying to have a conversation about that and how to think about it in the context of the debt burden, right? I mean,
Right. And if I can just say
Sure.
real quickly, and then I'll defer to Davenport. But when we were reviewing the capital program and the recommendations that were brought forward to be evaluated and looking at the out years, it became apparent pretty quickly that we were going to have some difficulty in future years, keeping within the debt limits that we set about 2 years ago now. So with that, we asked Davenport to evaluate those concerns and other concerns, and vis-a-vis why we're here right now. So with that, I'll defer to Joe from Davenport, whom you all know. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Good afternoon. It's good to be here. Finally, the sun shines, right? It's been quite rainy as of late. Let me pull this a little closer. Is that the green light is on? Is that bright green? Try again.
Sun always shines when Davenport comes to town. Right?
That's right. Yeah, keep that thought. Can you hear me now?
I'm going to give you
That's better. Yeah. I'm not often told to speak up, so I'm a little unused to it. So at any rate, again, good to be here. To my right, you may recognize this gentleman's face as well, Bob Dory. He's the city's bond counsel. Some of the strategies and thoughts that we put into today's presentation have been vetted by him. To my left, you've met both on the Finance Committee and with the Financial Advisory Commission. Kyle Laux, who has played an integral role in a variety of different tasks that we've undertaken for the city over the last few years. And last but certainly not least, to my far left, is a new member of our team, Ms. Jennifer Dirksen. She joined us about 6 months ago from Moody's Investor Service. Is a native of Howard County, and we're delighted to have her aboard. She brings, she buttresses a strength that we have in terms of understanding how the rating agencies think and so forth, and to have her brain and her thinking on some of those topics was also an integral part to what we looked at here today and what we'll be going through. So I'm going to take the first part of this. I don't think we'll be overly long, and try to sort of frame up the issues, although I think Bruce did an able job of that already. But you know, I would characterize this as this is an exercise. This is what the type of thing that the city probably should have been doing all along over the years, which is to be looking 5, 10, 15 years out into the future and making sure that the course that you set for yourselves, that you aren't getting, your debt load isn't growing faster, or you're not eating up sort of capacity under your policies by not paying enough attention to what the future holds. You make better decisions budget to budget when you're thinking long term. And so I think Bruce is to be commended for really pointing out this issue and having us take a closer look at it. So thank me later. So, no, it is a worthwhile exercise, and we do frankly see some of our, highly rated clientele in the Mid-Atlantic region, they go through much the same process. So it's something that's healthy to do periodically, and it shouldn't just stop at your debt policies. It really should continue on to look at your financial policies and the like, and you really should be looking at that on a fairly regular basis. So on the first page overview, we've talked about a little bit of this before, but I think it's worth noting that the city has undertaken a very concerted effort over the last several years to sort of recapitalize its general fund balance, get that in good shape. I think over the last year or so, as if you've read the audit, as the Finance Committee, I'm hoping you do, at least peruse it, you'll see that the audited financials look far cleaner, far healthier, far better than they have in probably the last 7 or 8 years. So that's a lot of hard work. That's a lot of smart decisions and tough decisions on the part of you folks that are sitting up there on the dais, as well as staff and folks like us. So that's a good, yes.
So, before you rush to the next page, I noticed a term here in the middle, recapitalizing fund balance reserves, which is an interesting phrase. I'm not sure I know what it means, but when we get further down, will you be telling us that?
No, I'll define it for you now. When you may recall a retreat that was held, I want to say 2010, 2011, Alderman, and about that time, I don't think we cover a whole lot of fund balance in here. This analysis is focused primarily on debt, but your fund balance reached a low point. The city was in several stages of various liquidity facilities that it had out to banks. We had the whole bond proceeds issue. Your general fund balance reserve, such as it was dwindling, and what was there was not particularly real, and we did a variety of things. Some decisions were made on the revenue side. There was some restructuring of some debt done. And recapitalize is probably an overly fancy term. Really, the point is to refill the bucket.
Right, replenish.
Replenish is
Okay.
a better word.
Because when capitalized, I think of investing, and so are we investing in fund balance reserves, but you mean replenish, okay.
Yeah, sometimes we just think of it as a recapitalization, but I like your word better. Ours is a little too flowery.
Great, thank you.
On the second page, so finishing up at the bottom of the page, we're really focused here on tax-supported debt. So, and that's what your current debt policies speak to, is tax-supported debt. You, as of a year and a half ago, started a revenue bond credit for your water and sewer, so this analysis naturally excludes that because those bonds are naturally self-supported by utility rates and charges. So on page 2, this is the current tax-supported debt profile of, another one of these? Current tax-supported debt profile of the city, and I think the thing that's most noteworthy about it is you really don't have much of a drop down in your debt service over the next several years. Okay? We have a little bit of a decline, and then an increase, and it sort of stays around just shy of $8 million for several years, and then you start to, beginning in about 2024, you start to pick up some capacity. And when I say capacity, typically in the realm of tax-supported debt, you have a more declining debt service structure, so that as you take on new debt, you're not piling, if you will, that new debt service on top of your existing. You can add the debt service in a more measured way, that you don't take quite the same budgetary cash flow impact right out of the gate. This structure is a little bit of an artifact of some of the restructuring we did for the city when we needed to replenish, I'll use your word, replenish the fund balance several years ago. It is what it is, but the byproduct of it is when you implement your 6-year capital improvement plan, if you do it in the same way that you've always done it, you're effectively stacking that new debt service on that sort of 7.8, 7.9 million, and it has a more immediate budgetary cash flow effect on your budget, and also on compliance with your debt policies, which are covered on page 3. So one of your policies is that you will not have tax-supported debt above 3% of assessed valuation of taxable property within the city. I think that's a local limitation. State law would permit you to borrow much more than that, but you've determined that it's in the city's long-term interest to set a lower limit.
That's pretty much what the charter limit is.
Yeah, okay.
The charter limit is actually 2.4 on real estate and 5%.
Okay.
It's just about 3%.
Okay. Other communities have a little bit more latitude. Okay. So, be that as it may, you can see when you look at the trend in assessed values and your outstanding tax-supported debt over time, you don't come anywhere near either the target ratio, effectively half the target ratio, and a third of the outside limit. So that's not really the governor on your debt issuance practices. And you can see when you project out on page 4, as you pay off your existing debt, you get more and more wiggle room under that particular limitation. If you turn with me to page 5, here's where it gets interesting. So you have a policy that you want to keep tax-supported annual debt service at no more than 12% of the general fund spending budget with a target ratio of 10%. If you recall, this used to be 8 and 10, and it was changed a couple of years ago to 10 to 12. And we had a lot of discussion around that. And so what we're trying to do in terms of studying all of this is to make sure that over time we don't bump up against, we stay within that band of 10 to 12%. You know, it was a tough decision to go to the 12%. You all spent a lot of time thinking about it, and you know, we don't want to have to go back either to you or to the rating agencies at some point and say we're going to increase it again. So planning ahead is prudent in that regard. And you'll see that historically you've crested above 10% in 2009, 2010. I think that had as much to do with the decline in the general fund budget as it did anything else. You see, out through fiscal year 2016, you're not yet at 10%. So why are we talking about this? Well, turn with me, if you would. Really, page 6 is sort of more of the same. It doesn't look quite. Okay, well, if you look at your planned expenditure growth and the assumptions therein, you do start to get out into a little bit above 10% in the 19-20 range. The other thing we care about on page 7 is your 10-year payout ratio. That's how rapidly you pay off your debt. And at 62%, I'd say you're about average. 65% is considered high. In this particular region of the country, 60% and above is pretty common. You want to maintain at least 55%. And nothing we're going to show you here is going to negatively affect that payout ratio in order to violate that policy. So now that we've sort of looked at what we look like presently and what the growth assumptions are going forward. By the way, when I talk about growth, for the purposes of this analysis, your budget for fiscal 18, your proposed budget grows by something like 4, 5%, something in that range. Maybe it's, depending on the decisions you make, maybe it'll end up at 2 or 3, who knows. What we've assumed here going forward is we're assuming growth in about the 2% range for the next couple of years and then 1% thereafter. So if the city's budget grows, if the property values in the city grow, some of the stuff that we're going to show you here in a couple minutes may not be an issue. You may grow yourself out of this problem. But it's better to have a plan in place to course correct if we need to, and have a strategy for how we manage this going forward if for some reason growth comes to a halt. We've been in a very, very long economic expansion. Hasn't necessarily felt like it. It's been, you know, roughly 2% GDP or less for 6 or 7 years, but that's a long expansion. we could very easily tip into recession in the next couple of years in spite of what we're doing at the federal level. So we think it's good to be conservative in our forecasts and good to be looking at this issue over the long run.
Joe, before you change, I'm not so sure we are that conservative on page 8. You're showing the flood mitigation, which is really the nuisance flooding, doesn't get into any of the infrastructure we're going to have to start thinking about, or at least planning for sea level rise. That's just to take care of the nuisance flooding, and I think that's going to be a much bigger ticket item than the nuisance flooding mitigation. So I wouldn't argue that this is a conservative picture, and in fact, in all the years I've been working on the capital improvement plan, I've never seen a really significant dip. I think we've had to struggle to keep it not growing along at a big pace like we're showing in 18 and 19 at a minimum, and in some years more than that. So I think these numbers are correct, but I'm not sure they're conservative.
And my description of conservative really was only intended to speak to the growth assumptions as it relates to assessed valuation and that part of the ratio. I take your point. A capital plan, most capital plans come out one of two ways. They're either a wish list that you can't possibly hope to affordably get to, or it's a prioritization within your means. And sometimes there are things that are thrown at you that you've got to address, and certainly sea level rise is one of them. I think Jennifer can speak to that. I think Moody's has put out some commentary on sea level rise, not necessarily just for Annapolis, but for, I think there's a report about Hampton Roads as well.
Yeah, that's very true. It's something that the rating agencies have really started to take a look at and have published on and have started asking municipalities about.
Excuse me, can you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. Jennifer Derrickson with Davenport.
While we have a break, Jim, is there any possibility we can close those windows? I'm having a terrible time hearing. I don't know, do we not have air conditioning? I know. Windows won't close? All right. All right, there we go. Yeah, it's, I'm going to have to get hearing aids, I know. Right now, I can't.
Is that better? Is that
Yeah.
a better mic?
Much
Better, Mike.
Yes, no?
Yes. Let's have 10 or 20 mics up there and. Right. Be a press conference.
Okay, so
Thank
So-
you, by the way.
with that backdrop and noting the CIP as was given to us, this is what we modeled. We could do the same analysis if you wanted to look at, some particular, if there were projects identified and properly costed out that would mitigate some of that sea level rise. It strikes me that those dollars are going to be so significant that at some point that's going to have to be a combined local, federal, state effort
Right.
to do all of that. So, but nonetheless, we can change the inputs and show you what the analysis looks like. We just, for the purposes of today, just went with the proposed CIP. So I'm going to turn it over, I'm sure you're thinking mercifully, to Kyle to walk us through some of the scenarios that we considered.
And nice to see everybody. Kyle Laux with Davenport. So starting on page 9, Joe, in sort of the beginning here, laid the framework. But what we'll start doing the next couple pages is to truly layer in the CIP as you saw it on page 8 under a couple different, we'll call scenarios, different ways we could go about borrowing the new dollars. Again, knowing that we've got multiple years of projects here, so you've got a variety of variables that are going to change. The cost of the project, the interest rates, the growth assumptions, all those things. But the goal here, as Joe mentioned at the outset, is to really understand what we look like 2, 3, 5 years from now, so you can be thinking about that type of time frame as opposed to simply, all right, what is our CIP, what's our borrowing due for next year. So on page 9, we really have 4 different scenarios, and again, this can be tweaked and amended based on our discussions here, but we wanted to lay out a couple different points, a couple different ways of looking at things. The first scenario, which we called Scenario 1, FY18 GO issuance only, that really includes simply what's programmed in to be borrowed for FY18. So sort of pretend for the moment that FY19 and future don't exist. If all we did was next year's borrowing, what do things look like? Just to give us a framework and a sense of kind of where we start. I'll note there that as we're talking about borrowing, the interest rates, the assumptions we've used in here are sort of hopefully reasonably conservative. We're still in a low rate environment. We're supposedly in a rising rate environment. So we've assumed for this purpose that dollars that we borrowed on a permanent basis in 2018 would be somewhere in the 4% range. If we did that tomorrow, we'd be well below that. But again, with what's happening at the federal level, with what's happening with the Federal Reserve, nobody really knows where that's headed. So the idea here is to be reasonably conservative, but ultimately we don't have any better crystal ball than anybody else does. So that's first case. Second case simply takes case 1 and layers in those future CIP years. So layers in the $5.6 million that you have programmed for 2018, and then the future years that total roughly $24 million from FY19 out to 2023. I think you'll see as we look at case 2, we've then looked at a case 3 and 4. We'll explain why in a minute, but cases 3 and 4 really look at 2 different ways you could think about sort of structuring the new debt on the tax-supported side to make sure that we are in compliance with our policies and keeping especially within that 10 to 12% range on debt service to expenditures. So case 3 looks at what we call deferred principal. I'll probably explain that a little bit as we get into that case. And case 4 is a strategy that as we sit here today seems to make some sense, and that's what we call a bond anticipation note, or a BAN strategy. So we'll talk through the details what all that means, but we basically laid out 4 different cases, all of which can be tweaked and amended as we go. We'll show you what the impact is. So you go over to page 10. You're going to see a lot of these pages in succession that look very much alike between the cases. All page 10 is doing is saying, all right, if we borrow that $5.6 million that we have programmed in for 2018, we do it with a very plain vanilla debt structure, meaning we repay it over 20 years with level debt service. How does that layer into our existing debt service?
And just to point out, column C on page 10, the 20-year level debt service, that's the way the city currently borrows for the long term. So case 1 or scenario 1 can almost be viewed as sort of a change nothing, base case. We're not doing anything different than what we've done historically.
So you can see dollar-wise what that means. I think graphically, as you flip to the next couple pages here, page 11, the old picture's worth 1,000 words. Dark green bars are your existing debt service. Light green bars are that estimated debt service in the $5.6 million. And you can see what happens over time. You would end up at a peak of about $8.1 million, whereas you're right now, it's probably closer to $8.2 million versus maybe $7.8 million in terms of existing debt service. So again, to Joe's point, anything that you do in terms of new debt services will getting added to that $7.8 million base over the next several years. So as you flip the page, the next 2 pages, we'll look and say, all right, if we just borrowed that $5.6 million next year, what is the impact to our debt ratios and our debt policies? So what you see on page 12, left-hand side, is your debt to assessed value. That was a ratio that Joe mentioned a couple pages ago. Not really close to that either statutory limit or our policy limit. You've got some good breathing room there. That's not as much of a concern on the left-hand side of the page. The right-hand side of the page, though, is your debt service to expenditures. basically that ratio of how many dollars, or how many pennies out of every dollar in the budget are going to pay debt service. We've got that 10 to 12% range. And even by adding just the 5.6 million program for next year, we kind of creep closer into that 10 to 12% range, really for what is 4 or 5 years there. And so you're still in compliance. If you said, all right, if we just did next year, what happens? You're in compliance with your policies, but obviously you're going to have needs beyond 2018. The world's not going to end with 2018, and so we keep going. So page 13, very simply, he said, what does this show me in scenario 1? We've got our 3 critical debt policies, debt ratios. Would you be in compliance with all 3 of them? You would. You get a nice green checkbox there. That's what we're showing there. More realistic, though, is likely as we get to scenarios 2, 3, et cetera, as we start thinking about future years beyond simply 2018. So as you get to page 14, a lot of numbers here. Basically what we've done is assumed that all the dollars identified in your 5-year CIP for bond funding, especially in future years, are included, roughly $34 million thereabouts. And again, as you look at those numbers, the debt structure here is the status quo, no change to what we've been doing, repaying the debt over 20 years with roughly level payments. So if you flip the page again to page 15, you have the graphical representation of what that looks like. So if we are right now, meaning FY17 in the roughly $7 million range, our existing debt service before we do anything new goes to the $7.8 million range. If we did this entire capital program exactly as it's laid out, your peak debt service going forward would be closer to $10 million. Then it'd ramp up over a number of years as the new dollars are borrowed. But it gets to the point of, as you're borrowing for new things, the fact that we have this roughly level, even increasing a little bit, existing debt structure means that barring some other change or faster growth in the budget, debt service will be taking up a larger proportion of the budget than it is today. And so if you flip the page again to page 16, I think you see that point in graphical form. Left-hand side of the page, debt to assessed value, we're still well below that threshold, even using conservative growth assumptions. Not particularly worried about that side of the equation. But if you take your eye to the right-hand side of the page, debt service to expenditures, you see we very quickly, I say quickly, relatively speaking, within 4 years, thereabouts, we're right up against that 12%, the maximum of the policy. And it's a red line on purpose because we don't really want to go above that as we think about the CIP. So what we see there is we're working with staff, obviously, to think about, all right, knowing these are our needs going forward, what are some ways that we can potentially mitigate this trend going forward and maintain the flexibility, debt service to expenditures wise, ultimately which ties back to flexibility in the budget. So you flip the page again. You can see debt to assessed value, you're fine. Debt service to expenditures, you got the red X, that's a problem / maybe question area, something we want to make sure we're taking a little harder look at. That's what we've done in the next couple pages. So if you go to page 18, Joe mentioned this earlier. The goal here, and to Mr. Arnett's point, Alderman Arnett's, the goal here is to be reasonably conservative, and that's what we've aimed to do given the CIP. To the extent you keep growing faster than what is projected in these ratios, meaning we've assumed that your budget grows at 2% for the next 2 years, then 1% thereafter. So really just keeping pace maybe with inflation. The idea being that's a little more conservative as you think about this ratio. To the extent you grow faster than that, that ratio on the right-hand side of the page is going to look better. So one area that might help you going forward, but you're not going to know until it happens, is if you do grow faster than is projected, you might be able to keep within that 12% policy. I think as we sit here, and the Davenport folks and staff think about that, we would be maybe gambling a little bit, to use that term, as to what's actually going to happen as you go forward. So scenarios 3 and 4 look at a more proactive strategy of, without counting on future growth that we don't know if it's going to happen or it is going to happen, how do we keep those ratios closer to, more in line with where we want to be, without having to use our crystal ball, but again, we don't have any better than anybody else. So that takes us to what we called scenario 3. In scenario 3, we call the deferred principal strategy. So what's happening here is that we're borrowing the same amount of dollars. We haven't changed what's in the CIP. Just kind of took that as a given, so we're not changing too many variables at one time, and said if we were to go out and borrow permanent dollars annually, like we've been doing, but instead of going immediately into principal repayment, we give ourselves a couple years of interest only and then go into a 20-year repayment structure. So the theory of there being, both from a budgetary standpoint and as you're building the projects, you're not paying principal until such time as you're able to sort of use and enjoy and have those projects that you're building available to you.
And let me just add one thing. A deferred principal strategy is not so out of the norm as you might think it would be. Your neighbors across the circle, the state treasurer's office, they're constitutionally limited to 15-year debt, but they don't pay principal for like a year and a half. So they're doing 15-year debt and really amortizing the principal over about 13 years on average. So that's, just wanted to give you a sense that if you wanted to go down this path, you wouldn't be the only ones in town doing so.
So again, a little bit interest only at the front end of things. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead, if I could, to page 22.
20 which?
22. Sorry, I just skipped one page. And show you what the impact to your ratios is of doing that quote-unquote deferred principal strategy. And on the left-hand side, again, debt to assessed value there's effectively no impact to debt to assessed value by virtue of doing that strategy. But on the right-hand side, we've got, aside from 1 year that really we could probably structure around, we've got a little bit of daylight, not much, relative to that debt service to expenditure policy. So as you see these pages, you see the cases, again, debt service to expenditures is that policy limitation we're trying to work around. One way to think about it is to say, all right, we'll give ourselves a couple years of interest only while we build and construct the projects. That will give us a little more flexibility to build into the payments, to kind of grow into the payments on the debt as we take it on. You're still borrowing at a long-term rate when you go out and do that. So if we were to go out and borrow today, you'd likely be in the 3 to 4% range if we did this. So you don't get the advantage of a short-term rate per se, but you are locking in from the get-go to a repayment structure that gives you a little more flexibility, debt service to expenditures wise. So if you flip page 23, again, debt to assessed value, you're fine. Debt service to expenditures, you get 1 year that's a blip there. You could probably work around that if you had to. Payout ratio continues to be in the 60s, which is above your policy and keeps you within the sort of national medians, as Jen can allude to. So with that, we'll go to page 4, which or scenario 4, our last scenario here. The last scenario we've called a bond anticipation note strategy. So that's short for a BAN. I think BAN is short for a bond anticipation note, which is really just interim financing for a couple of years. It does a couple things that are similar to the prior case and a couple things that are a little different from the prior case. In terms of similarities, it gives you, from a cash flow perspective, gives you that interest-only period to build into the payments as you're taking on the projects. And again, not pay principal immediately before the projects are, in theory, done and completed and you're enjoying them. So in that sense, it's similar to scenario 3. The mechanics of it and likely the interest rates of it are a little different. Because when we talk about a bond anticipation note, what we're really talking about is a strategy whereby we would borrow short-term dollars, meaning in this case we would assume 3 years. So like a 3-year interim financing, you pay interest only on that interim financing, and then for purposes of modeling, we assume in that 4th year the loan gets taken out for 20 years, again with level debt service. And so what you have that's a little different than the scenario 3 is you're likely going to be borrowing at a lower rate because you're borrowing interim financing, all things being equal. You've got flexibility to sort of tailor the ultimate repayment structure when you take out that interim financing based upon the budget and the economy and your cash flows at the time that the permanent financing occurs. And so some similarities and a couple differences versus scenario 3. The idea being you've got a little more flexibility to tailor things with this strategy than if we just dove straight into permanent financing like in scenario 2 and scenario 3.
So again, just to introduce a little perspective, using bond anticipation notes is, again, a pretty common approach. We've done it successfully to help implement a large school capital program in the city of Richmond, where we're headquartered. As Mr. Miller can tell you, bond anticipation notes are done all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for a different reason. There they have to manage, from a cash flow perspective, something called Proposition 2.5, which is a tax limitation. And so they're looking to manage cash flow and budget. Here, the band strategy, as we're calling it, doesn't necessarily, I mean, it does provide you a benefit from a cash flow perspective, but you're trying to manage not something that's a legal limitation, you're trying to manage a self-imposed policy, set of policy guidance that you've put on, you've taken on to yourself. So again, a very commonly used practice, just wanted that to be understood.
Discussion? Well, are we done, or?
We can, well, we just go through
I
the
guess-
results, and then we want to just summarize some pros and cons, and then we'll be done here just momentarily.
Yep. So page 26, you've seen this page obviously before. Left-hand side, you're fine. Right-hand side, debt service to expenditures, just even a little more daylight, meaning more flexibility relative to those ratios than you had in scenario 3. So that's an advantage.
Page 27 keeps
27,
you
yep.
compliant. Sure, so 28 sort of summarizes at least our thoughts. You may have others. We're open to a discussion of them on why we think this might be something to consider. You know, it certainly, the strategy works. We see when we run the numbers that it does help alleviate the strain on your debt service to expenditures policy. As Kyle mentioned, you are borrowing at the shorter end of the yield curve, so you're borrowing on a fixed rate basis for 2 or 3 years, and then eventually taking that out with longer term financing. Doesn't place any undue strain on any of your other policies, so if the watchword is first do no harm, it does not do any harm in that regard. As Kyle also mentioned, it does provide you, you know, you could issue a bond anticipation note, you know, this summer for your 2018 needs, and as I said, we could very easily turn into a recession, you know, a year or 2 or 2.5 years out while that bond anticipation note is still outstanding. We hit a recession, and you'll be very glad that would have the ability to then structure the long-term debt that takes the ban out in a way that's budget-friendly versus had we issued long-term fixed-rate debt in July this year, short of doing a restructuring, which could be expensive, you wouldn't be able to get out from under those payments. So you have more flexibility. We keep coming back to that term. Now, there are a couple of downsides We wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't tell you what those look like. Number one, when you borrow today, and it's a relatively low interest rate environment, you lock in that low fixed interest rate for however long you borrow the money for. Typically, it's 20 years. If you borrow for projects on a bond anticipation note, you can't control what happens to the overall level of interest rates. So when you go to take this ban out 2 or 3 years from now, you may be in a higher interest rate environment. That's what the market's telling us. Let me rephrase that. That's what the market punditry is telling us. We haven't really seen any evidence of rates going up appreciably. They've been basically going up from the election to mid-January, then back down, and we've basically been sideways since the beginning of April. Maybe even a little bit down overall for the month. The other consideration or risk, if you will, and then I think we'll stop and open it up for any questions, is market access. That's a relatively pinhole, I'd characterize it, pinhole risk. That would mean one of two things. Either, I think we use the term cataclysm here, maybe that's a little overwrought, but it's not unprecedented. If you think back to 2008, 2009, collapse of Lehman Brothers, et cetera, the markets for a short period of time completely seized up. That can happen again. It hasn't happened very often in history, but the time you need to go take this bond anticipation note out, when it comes due, if you don't otherwise have the cash to pay it off, and you need access to the long-term markets, and it's not there, then you've got a problem. Again, very remote risk, but nonetheless one we had to point out to you. And then similarly, if you drive the ship of state, so to speak, off the dock and into the water financially over the next several years, your ratings are downgraded. They'd have to be downgraded very, very far from where they are now because they're up in very high territory. It's possible that you could end up not able to affordably access the markets. Typically, we don't even think about market access. There's usually market access for any investment grade rated credit. Investment grade is rated BBB. That's the lowest investment grade rating. You're in the high AA category. So there's a lot of room between you and them. Again, a remote risk, but one we're duty bound to tell you about. So we think it's a good idea to maybe, it doesn't have to be every single year of the capital plan turns out to be a ban, but doing this from time to time helps give at least a little bit of extra wiggle room in how you manage your overall debt portfolio, just because we don't know, none of us have perfect knowledge about what the economy is going to do, what revenues are going to do, and so forth. And so we respectfully submit this as something that's a useful tool to help manage your debt policy compliance. And with that, we'd open it to any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. We'll start with Alderman Arnett.
Okay, so first thing, and I'm glad David Jarrell is here, in this sheet, it wasn't just that we weren't planning or building in money for sea level. There's a lot of things that we didn't do. We've been kicking down the road, major vehicle replacement, major equipment replacement. These are $250,000 and bigger pieces of investment and various other things. We've been very parsimonious in what this Capital Steering Committee has let through the gate to the Finance Committee and then on to the Council. So again, I think we're starting from a pretty conservative platform. And then I would say scenario one, I mean, that's just if we never did anything ever again, right? So we don't pay attention to scenario one. Although that would be a wonderful world because our total debt service would only be $113 million. So the other three scenarios, I'm trying to figure out, nothing in this world is for free. So what is it that it costs us? And it looks like across these three scenarios, if you look at total debt service, there isn't a huge difference. 160.5 million, 162.4, and $164 million in total debt service. Is that the only catch? I mean, because I remember we've had discussions about bans before, and it was sort of like, ooh, don't go there. I know the FAC, the Financial Advisory Commission, Leek and attest to this, thought that it wasn't a good place for us to go, but it does seem like there's a very marginal, over time, so obviously the game here is to stay below a certain ceiling, but over time, the total cost is negligible between these three realistic scenarios. Am I correct in thinking that?
I think, Alderman, order of magnitude-wise, I think you're exactly right. As you look at over a long-term time period, you know, as these scenarios are laid out, as the assumptions in here are laid out, it's not a particularly big difference. You know, probably your one primary risk area is what interest rates are going to do in the future, and so that can be something that's going to move these obviously up and down over time. But the reality is, as you're comparing cases, whether you do permanent financing every single year or some interim financing and then permanent financing, rates are going to change a little bit every year. So that's going to help sort of bring the difference between the various cases, you know, likely closer to each other. So I think that's a fair characterization as you sit here today. Again, not knowing what interest rates are going to do in the future, but over a life cycle sort of view of it, it's not a really big difference in terms of overall debt service. On an annual basis, it could be a fairly big difference as you think about next year's budgets, future year's budgets, et cetera. I think one other area we may have alluded to that's an advantage is with a ban, you can maybe more efficiently borrow dollars as you need them, as opposed to having to lump a bunch of dollars that you may not need for a couple of years together into a big public bond issue that takes more time to gear up. Doing some interim financing or bans, whatever you're going to call it, is likely going to be a quicker, more efficient strategy. And so it'd be, from a time perspective and likely a cost perspective, you could get into the market quicker, which will allow you to sort of borrow dollars as you need it, not have to borrow a bunch of dollars ahead of time you don't need for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think Annapolis is not any different than any other community. I mean, sometimes you put a project in the CIP and you have every intention, because your lawyer tells you that you have to have every intention of spending that money over a constrained period of time in order to borrow tax exempt, but then something happens. You know, you discover you don't have a permit for something, you don't own a piece of property that you need to do a project, and you get delayed on a project, and you're suddenly in a situation where you're paying interest on long-term fixed-rate debt and can't get the proceeds spent. A bond anticipation note strategy allows you to wait until just the right time, meaning, okay, the contract's out to bid, we've got the bids back, we know what it's going to cost, now let's go get the money, and only get what we need, as opposed to, you know, sort of rolling the dice and hoping if we stick everything in one big pot, it'll all work out. So in the long run, it can actually save you money, depending on what happens to interest rates, of course.
So the assumptions on page 9 of the interest rates are a pretty important background to this, but I think you had indicated, I mean, obviously right now we're well below 4%, so
That's correct.
These are in themselves a pretty conservative set of assumptions for interest rates.
Yes, sir.
And the ban itself is really going into the short-term capital market rather than issuing bonds? I mean, how do you come up with the ban money?
You can sell, and again, I use New England as an example, you can sell bond anticipation notes in the public markets. The universe of buyers is going to be different. There are people that only want bonds that go out a certain, you know, every sort of category of investor wants different parts of the yield curve because that's their investing sweet spot. Can't tell you who exactly is in the short-term market, but there is a market out there. There's also an equally large and robust market in the world of direct bank lending. So direct bank lending. So as you did for your cash flow liquidity needs, you could also go out for a fixed rate bond anticipation note, and you should expect, given your name and your credit ratings, you should expect to get a good number of bids back from banks at fairly reasonable and flexible terms. I mean, that's candidly how we would do it, because again, if you do a public market bond anticipation note, that involves lots of time and energy in preparing a public offering document and getting the bonds or bands rated. Given your credit standing and your name, you don't need to go through that headache. It'd be better, faster, cheaper to go directly to the banks and have them compete for your business.
I guess I would ask the finance department or the city manager vis-a-vis the CIP. I mean, Tom, you know, and certainly you know, Bruce, that we really did rein in significantly on the capital spending, and we've been doing that for the last several years. And part of it is being mindful of bumping up against the debt ceiling. Bruce, your warning was that this year we're at 11, and we get into any big stuff, we'll get to 12 in a hurry. And it looks like there's an out-year bulge that happens even after you try to stop from getting to 12 on every one of these bar charts. So plotting the course for the next 4 years, the next term, are we at risk of kicking the can down the road and finding ourselves in difficult waters after the elections, or how are you seeing it as you're plotting out the longer-term financial course for the city?
Well, I think, quite frankly, this is what we were trying to address with this presentation. You're absolutely right. The more capital that we approve, the more pressure is going to put on the budget. And we have to be mindful of that. We're trying to develop a long-term financial strategy that matches the increases in the impact of the capital plan. Because, as you know, the capital plan rolls very definitely as a function of debt service and the operating plans on the outgoing years. I think the operating budget, I think none of us have a crystal ball, but I think that is relatively understood and can be relatively managed from year to year. For example, there are exceptions to that, if you will. I think the police department is an example of that, where 3 years ago nobody would have targeted it at that per se, but I think we can absorb those influxes, and that's what we get back to, and why we always talk about flexibility. We have to maintain the flexibility within the budget. So, again, this document, as presented, tries to go to that. I think Kyle alluded to it, and Joe alluded to it too, is the flexibility on the cash flow basis that this plan provides. Relative to, if I can just take a comment on the band anticipation notes, I don't remember a conversation of that being bad. It was the revenue anticipation notes or the temporary borrowing that we had to do years back just to get to have working capital. That's definitely behind us. Knock on wood, stays behind us. But we did have a bond anticipation note about 3 years ago as a way to get away from paying debt service that we weren't using. Because if we're not going to use the capital proceeds because of constraints on the operational side, a ban is a good alternative. And I think this strategy goes a long way into demonstrating that if we use such a strategy, we get away, we can stay underneath the 12%. If we do not use a ban strategy, within next year, or maybe the third year out, is basically when we're going to have to shut down the capital improvement plan, unless there's a significant change in the funding of that. So, I think, you know, we really have to start paying attention to the dollars that we borrow and how, and what borrowing strategies that we use to facilitate all the moving parts. And we're going to be continuing as every year as we add on new projects. It doesn't stop 5 years out. This presentation stops 5 years out, but the capital plan is not going to stop 5 years out. There's going to be additional pressures.
Never ends.
It never ends. So, you know, we're going to always have to be mindful of the next 5 years out as we move down the pipe.
So, looking at page 24, I can't tell whether that implies skipping the principal in 18 and then doing the first band borrowing in 19, and in 20 we're still paying that, but borrowing another one, and then 21 we actually have 3 borrowings going on, and from there on we'll have 3 levels of bond anticipation notes going on, and that will be how it'll go forevermore. There'll be a series of bond anticipation notes and then bond issuance.
What I foresee is that this is a plan, okay? But the reality is the bond anticipation notes are going to be a function, the permanent financing as a result of the bands are going to be the result of what projects we can put and complete. As Joe mentioned, by doing a band strategy, you have much more flexibility relative to if priorities changes, okay, if we approve a project and it's delayed and or the priority changes and we don't do it, we're not borrowing money for that project and then going, well, we don't need that money. What do we do with it now? And for 3 years, paying debt service and paying down the principal. So that provides, you know, again, this is the roadmap. I fully expect that the roadmap and the actual how we implement it is going to be a little bit different because dollars change, priorities change, whatever. It also gives us the ability, if we see something in the market, we can move on that.
How do the bond rating agencies look at the band strategy?
They're used to seeing bands. It doesn't really have a rating impact necessarily, and in addition to that, it doesn't hit the debt burden or the debt to expenditures while they're outstanding. So as we've mentioned and Bruce was talking about it, it provides some more flexibility there. I think, you know, as far as keeping within that 12% target that the city has established is very important. 10 to 12% is what you typically see for local governments, and I think since you just raised that, you know, fairly recently, staying within that is something that's going to be important to the city's rating going forward.
Yeah, if I can piggyback on that, you know, I think one of the things that brought us forward from the rating agencies is the city demonstrating its commitment to policies. Number one, implementing new policies or updating new policies, but staying true to the commitment that we have made to the rating agencies. 2 years ago, we said we have revised the rating, the borrowing up to 12%. 2 years later, we go and increase it to 15%. I think they would say, well, obviously, you don't have the ability to stay within that. You don't have the commitment or the wherewithal, and all the red flags will be, you know, and the red lights will be flashing. I think this is a very prudent and responsible way to mitigate those concerns also.
So in the context of this year's budget, obviously, we need to start having this conversation. And it strikes me, the next round of our triennial assessment is next year. So in some ways, the point is, even if you had a very modest CIP going forward and the assessments went up substantially over the next 3 years, you probably, you might put that off for a moment, right? But to Alderman Arnett's point, what we've been doing for the last couple of years is really trimming the CIP to just the bare bones, and what we really need to do is get serious about spending on some infrastructure projects sooner rather than later before everything totally falls apart. So, I mean, I think that's sort of the headwinds here in this conversation, that we need to figure out, how to do that. I mean, I guess the other lever, and we've had this conversation in the past. I see David Gerald back there. I mean, if we had the nerve to basically take general roadways out of the CIP every year and fund it in the budget, you would probably never hit. In 2023, for the next 5 years, you'd be $2 million smaller on what you were bonding. But we'd have to figure out where to come up with $2 million to do it. But I actually think, it's a good conversation for us to get to on some of these issues, because, for us and for the next council, these are going to be the issues they have to wrestle with. So I think, ideally there is some mix of the band seems like a good tool to be able to have at your disposal. The question is, how do we get more serious about PAYGO, and how do we get more serious about the whole package and try and move that forward?
Every time we make it easier to borrow, we borrow.
Well, yeah, and I do think the 12% is, you heard it, it's a prudent threshold,
It
but
forces us to have that conversation.
I think it's going to, yes, it will force you to have the PAYGO conversation, because you're not going to be able to do everything that you want.
I believe, I'm not running again, so it's easy for me to say, but I think there is a dynamic where the idea that every year we borrow $2 million to do roadway improvements, and we know we're going to do that in perpetuity, figure out a way to put that in the general fund, so that when we decide what the federal state project is, the big sea level rise lift in the next 5 years, we have some ability to handle it, right? I mean, that's what we need. That's what the CIP is for doing the big, once every 10, 20 year project, right? That we have to, so.
But the reason we have a finance committee meeting is the other things that we need to fill in here are in different venues when we're discussing drop programs and the contributions to the pension fund, like we were the other day, and we are low, and we're maybe hanging on by our fingernail to stay at 90% funded, which is good, but it keeps the pressure for that to keep going down, and that puts more and more pressure on the general fund, which means there's less and less opportunity to go to PAYGO kinds of things, which means we really do have to manage this capital fund. I agree with the city manager. We can't push these investments off forever. Eventually, automobiles and fire trucks will just break down on the highway and be towed away. So this was a very interesting and helpful presentation for me. I appreciate it.
Thing during the course of this whole thing, and I misstated it, so I'd better correct it before. The limit on debt, the debt limit that's in the charter says 10%. When the state went from the 40% assessment to the 100% assessment back in like 2000, the last paragraph of that 200-page bill said, yeah, and all the other things like ratings, you go down to 40% of what you had before as far as your real estate, so that basically you didn't get to take your debt limit up to 2.5 times what it was before. Right. So anyway, so I said 2.4, it's actually 4% for real estate and 10% for personal property.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from? Thank you very much for taking the time and the presentation. It's very, very helpful.
Thank you.
So I was trying to help there, David, you know, trying to beat the drum.
Good
Welcome.
afternoon.
Afternoon.
David Gerald, Director of Public Works. I guess before we start, just wanted to give my editorial comments on the ban, because we're hugely in favor of the ban. And the reason being is that before we can start a project, Bruce has to certify that there's funds available for us to basically do anything. So by forcing us to wait to start anything, even procurement for a design firm, until we have the bond money in hand, means that that money is necessarily going to sit there for a long time as we go through the procurement for a design firm, go through the engineering and design phase, go through the procurement for a construction contract, and then the construction. It feels like we're sitting on all that money for a long time, where if we have the ban, we're not sitting on money, we're just sitting on the ban, but we can move forward with all of those steps before we have the money in hand. So that's, from the guy that executes the projects, that's a huge advantage for us. So we're very supportive of that.
That's very helpful, Matt.
concept.
And thinking about sort of as we get into this, I mean, part of the exercise every year is taking the money that was obligated to projects in previous years that didn't get spent for a variety of reasons, because either the timeline got behind or some other decision was made in the interim. But so it would make some sense that if you had the flexibility of that, you probably would be, yeah, you'd be much more on point when it came time for the actual dollars to flow.
That's
3
right.
years
So
in.
like this, for this current fiscal year, the projects were approved, last June to be available, supposedly available July 1st, but then the bond issuance occurred in December. So nothing could happen with any of those projects until that bond issuance. So,
Thank you.
so I guess we're going to review projects. Do you want to start with the monies that sweep up and where we are on the projects?
Haven't we done some?
Okay. Hello. Melissa Lehman, Assistant Finance Director, just for the record. So this master spreadsheet that I distributed to you all today, and I also emailed to you earlier, is basically just an expanded version of what I gave out a couple weeks ago that shows what was proposed for FY18. I'll just go over, I guess, exactly what it is that you're looking at. This is a list of all projects that have been included in the CIP over the last several years. Some of these projects go back to, 2005, probably longer than that. There are projects that are open, which are in columns E through columns K, really. And then there are also projects on here that were included in the plan, the CIP, but were not approved for funding, which is in column D. So for example, in row 10, standard specifications and construction detail, $100,000. That was a project that was included in FY17, but it was not approved for funding. Then if you go further down, columns L and on through columns L through columns U are the projects that were proposed for funding, which was, again, in that spreadsheet that was given out to you a couple weeks ago. So in the general fund alone, there are total unspent bond funded projects of $11.6 million. Now this includes funds that are currently available of $7.1 million, which you'll find in column H, and funds that are already encumbered to be spent. So vendors that have already been procured, I guess, would be the best way of describing that. In columns J through K, these are funds from projects that are still open that have available bond funds to be reappropriated, and they have been reappropriated to projects that were proposed in FY18. The vehicle replacement is one of them, $405,000. The recreation management software is another $130,000. And from there, David, I'll turn it over to you.
So, one of the things that we talked about in the Davenport presentation was looking at the future and what those dollar amounts look like, and basically what they did is that they took for the columns P through T, the row 38 numbers, so like 9.9 million for FY19, 3.3 million for FY20, and so forth. I think we all know that those are pretty conservative numbers, because typically the out year projects are not as constrained as the one for the next future year where we're actually appropriating the money. So for example, line item 16, which is the flood mitigation project, we're showing $5 million for next fiscal year. That does address sea level rise because what we're doing is correcting the flood nuisance through the storm drain system, and the reason why we have so much flooding through the storm drain system is because of sea level rise over the last 50 years. But we're very optimistic that a good portion of that $5 million will come from either a FEMA grant that we've applied for, $3.5 million, or from the state, because the state gave us $1 million as sort of a down payment on that project, and we anticipate that there'll be more money coming from the state. So this year we're getting the plans and specs together for that project so we can go back to the state next session and make the presentation and make the pitch for additional money for that project. So, but that full $5 million was incorporated into the Davenport analysis. In fact, that's why that's such a big number for that year, the $9.9 million. It's such a bump up is because of that $5 million that year. If we're successful in getting that outside money, then that number will become smaller. When we talked about CIP last time, we talked about sort of the annual projects that we do every year. And that's really a big chunk of these projects because that includes roadways, which was mentioned, but also the facility projects, the vehicle replacement, the storm drain projects, the water and sewer projects, sidewalks are all projects that we basically fund to the same amount year after year after year. And then we have a few add-on projects each year that are unique requirements, such as the swimming pool, Main Street rebricking, city coordinate system, some of those. So the challenge really is how do we deal with that whole chunk of annual projects, and how do we make sure that's being adequately funded, because you know the old adage, you pay me now or pay me later. That's really true for all those projects. The more we defer those projects, the bigger the backlog of maintenance and repair, the more it's going to cost in the future. And that's true of all of these assets, but you know it's particularly true for streets because as you let streets degrade, they become much more expensive to fix than if you can catch them early. Vehicles, we have an old fleet that's getting older. We don't necessarily see the increased operations and maintenance costs because it's built into the budget, and we've had an old fleet for a number of years, so it feels like you know, we always have high costs because we always have had an old fleet. But if we ever were able to catch up and get a more updated fleet, those costs would go down without a doubt. So it's really a quandary of how we fund those on an annual basis, and then do the financing for the one-time projects. So. Is there any need to go through each individual project? Do you have questions about individual projects?
Of course, but first, help me, where did sidewalks go to?
Sidewalks went all the way down to the bottom of the list.
It's on the other side.
Because that's a revolving fund.
Oh, there is another side, okay.
Yeah.
All right. No, I wanted to make sure, but
Yeah, you did.
what I thought would be good, and I know there's a couple that Joe Budge wanted to talk about and he couldn't be here, but I thought it'd be useful to look at the ones that are on the list, such as number 10, row 10, that we in the steering committee decided not to fund. I'm not even sure I know what standard specification and construction details are, but I think we're at the going once, going twice, you're out point. So is that something that needs any reconsideration?
Well, it's standard specifications. We're planning to fund that over several years from the operating budget.
Okay.
We feel like that's a very important thing. We have standard specifications that all the engineers use, whether they're development projects or city projects. And so when those projects come in for city review, we expect them to incorporate all the standard details in those specs. Ours are really old and outdated, so they need to be updated. So that's one of those. It wasn't funded last year. It came forward as part of the CIP and wasn't funded, so we're going to phase fund that over several years from our engineering budget. So I would leave it just the way it is here, and we'll
Okay.
find money within the operating budget to fund it.
Good by me. Next one is Russell Street, line 18, 940,000.
Yeah, that was one to install a sidewalk. That's the walking route back to the Bates Senior Center, so there's a bus stop along West Street.
Mm-hmm.
There was going to be a sidewalk put in right along the Toyota dealership. And that's just deferred because there wasn't funding last year, so that was,
Alderman Kirby, isn't there,
that goes all the way back to when
no, Russell Street, before we get to Barber.
it's 18, row 18. Row 18.
Row 18.
Pretty bad shape.
No, I agree. Yeah, so, at some point, if we're not gonna do it today, at some point, colleagues who have projects in their ward need to, talk to the finance committee about, should we be doing something about that? And maybe I'm feeling gracious now that we have all that band room that we can,
Well,
spend some
part of
more
that
money.
goes back to the infill sidewalk issue too, and how much responsibility the
Right.
city has for infill sidewalks, as opposed to just repairing sidewalks.
Cornhill Street, I think, is going to be taken care of when we get the money from the sale of the old rec center, which is imminent. But I know it's something that was important to Alderman Budge.
Cornhill Street is fully designed. We're ready to award the construction contract for that, and so yeah, that's basically ready to go. We plan to do it.
And will we have enough money for that when we get the,
Yes,
okay.
the rec center money is going to fund it.
Cornhill, does it have total new piping underneath and all of that now?
Yeah, so BGE replaced the natural gas line, which caused extensive damage to our water line, so then we came in behind that and replaced the water line. We checked the sewer, and the sewer's in good shape, so all the utilities are in good shape. So we're not doing anything to the road at all, we're just doing the curbs and sidewalks.
So we ain't gonna have to rip up
Hey, wait, Fred, we're coming to West Annapolis next. Fred, right after Eastport Fire Station is West Annapolis intersections. So I'm assuming since we're making temporary fixes to Eastport Fire Station, that just stays in the parking lot?
Yes.
The building is structurally sound, is it not?
Yes.
So really, I think at some point we ought to talk about, is that something that we just put a smaller amount and refurbish that building in its final, and make that
And the
one go up?
volunteers are putting money into it as well.
Right,
to
although
help fix it up,
they're
but-
severely hampered now with the changes in the LSAP, so they may not be.
Right.
But still, I've talked with people who seem to know the structure of the building is good. I think Chief Stokes believes that.
Yeah.
Some of the insides, particularly with segmenting for men and women, and that's something that's
And that's
on
what
the way
we're
right.
going to address, and we're also
Right.
going to address they've had that trailer for years next to it for a workout room, so we're going to add on to the
Right.
building and incorporate that.
Okay, so, we'll leave it on the list, but I think it ought to be on the parking lot for reconsideration for the capital steering committee. Why leave that big chunk of money, although we already borrowed for it and then repurposed it? Why leaving it in when we know we're never probably really gonna get to that in the foreseeable future? West Annapolis intersections and traffic. I don't know what that is, but that's yours, Fred.
Yes, it is. Let's find out what exactly you had
Yeah,
in mind.
I'm not sure I know exactly what that is either. Is that an old one on here, or is that one between this year? No.
Well, there's some dangerous conditions, and particularly in the business part of West Annapolis on the sidewalks. I won't get into the roads, at least not today, but they are, you know, not handicap accessible. Frankly, even with the curb cuts, the sidewalk in some places is in such bad shape, I would not even want to push a wheelchair or similar device on the sidewalk, because I think it would be very difficult to do. We are trying to, you know, boost the business district over there, and I would invite you to take a little ride maybe one afternoon and allow me to show you some of the places that I think are the worst spots. I certainly hope you get to us this year. It's good to know that we're almost 20 points behind the Truxton Park tennis courts and fence, but that's somebody else's judgment to make, I realize. Do you know which intersection specifically you had in mind?
I do not, no. I need to find out more about that project, and I'll certainly
Yeah.
circle back
Okay.
with you on that.
So I think part of this exercise, and I do, because I think we're pretty ready to close up on the CIP unless we get input from our colleagues, is just to look at these ones that are on there but didn't get any funding and make sure they still are viable and that they ought to happen. Sixth Street is getting changed significantly by the annex from the Annapolis Yacht Club on both sides, and I'm not sure, that's a $6.6 million is a lot. It's in the so-called Gateway Viewshed, and I know that the Eastport Business Association asked me from time to time on both this one and the 4th Street one, when are we going to see anything? I can say on the 4th Street project, there is a lot of activity getting ready to happen on 4th Street. There's a building on the boatyard side that they're talking about totally renovating and putting Adams Rib in there. On the other side, there's a Victorian building that is for sale, and people are interested in that. I've been approached by Tecumseh, who need money, and they're now interested in talking about some kind of partnership with the city for structured parking in the air rights over their parking lot, which would relieve a lot of parking pressures on that commercial street in 4th Street, and those parking pressures may or may not increase with the completion of the sail loft there with its commercial strip right along the end of 4th Street at Chesapeake. So I think those two, when it goes back, what's the original group called? The planning, not the steering committee, but the one that meets before us?
Yep.
Yours. Pardon me? Right. I think maybe on the parking lot for them is to just go back and look at these ones that we perpetually don't fund, and either take them away or modify them or repurpose them. The 4th Street one, I think if we could get a structured parking garage at Tecumseh, that would be huge for Eastport, particularly since Eastport's becoming a parking lot these days anyway, so we might want to reconsider that. Barwood Lane is yours again, Kenny.
So Barwood Lane, the street's been paved, the drainage is being addressed. The remaining things to be done on that, if the residents would like, would be the curb and the sidewalks. So those are the two things that we won't have. So that's the determination, is how much of an appetite there is for curb and sidewalk along that street. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, there's only a couple left. Smithville Street. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Smithville is So that's the extension of Russell after you turn there by the Bates Center.
Right.
And that's basically a similar type of upgrade to that street as Barbud. So it's to add curb and gutter and sidewalks and to make it a complete street.
So again, on the early planning committee, it would be interesting to hear that committee's thoughts on trade-offs between some of these kinds of things versus some of the big capital equipment pieces that we also cut way back. What's more important, a dump truck or Smithville Street, kind of a discussion. Then we have the
I guess my question is, did it when it came out of that group and then went to the group that has the outside folks from the planning commission and you, I mean, did the sort of the cuts to this 9 million mark happen there, or did it happen at the capital
There was
group?
some of each, but a lot of that came to the capital steering committee. But I've been sensitive.
So some of these were funded, is what you're saying, and
Right.
what
Some
came
of
out of the staff
some of
driven
them
group.
move forward, but the problem with sitting on the capital steering committee is, I'm me in Ward 8. I'm not necessarily thinking about what pressure Sheila's feeling or Kenny's feeling, and that's in fact why I wanted to go through this
No,
exercise.
I agree. You're trying to
Yeah, so
trying to get a sense of what the thought was of the
Right.
professional staff either way.
the way the system works is the capital working committee, which is made up principally of department directors, just validate the score. So the departments that are requesting the project score it, and then the working committee validates the score. They don't assign dollars, they don't assign whether it's funded or not funded.
There's no sort of
They just
ranking
do the
one type of
ranking
project against
and then
another, which
send
is
it
what
to the
Ross
steering
did.
committee.
That's what I assumed it was. So it's
Right.
so yeah. I mean, this is the place where if people have particular projects they like that don't have any dollars next to them now, to try and figure out whether we want to do it, and then
Right.
how to make it fit under whatever number it has to be under. I mean, that's Alderman Finlayson.
Yes, it would be nice if the steering committee would ask the aldermen what the projects are in our ward. Staff doesn't always know what those things are that we're hearing concerns about, like Russell Street,
Okay.
for example. I mean, that came straight from the Bates Legacy Center, because those are the folks who walk that dangerous road without any sidewalks and any curbs. I do have a couple of questions, however. The items in green are bond funding from the state. Can you tell me, under flood mitigation, we got 998,000. We only actually used 24,000, and 77 is encumbered. So what happens to the other 896?
Yeah, so that was actually $1 million from the state. It was in the state budget, so that's not actually a bond bill, it was in the state budget.
Mm-hmm.
So what's being done right now and what the money's being used for is just the concept. Development of alternatives for fixing the storm drain system so we don't have the nuisance flooding. So we've awarded a contract for about $100,000 to do that. As soon as we arrive at what the preferred alternative is, and we're going to have public meetings, and we're going to HBC and businesses and community, as soon as the preferred alternative is determined, then we're going to move to detailed design where we develop plans and specs for that.
So
So
will
once
that-
we have plans, then we're going to go back to the state and ask for construction money. So a good portion of that $1 million is going to be used for that detailed design, because that's about a $5 million project. That's why the $5 million in FY19 for the storm drain system. So usually design costs somewhere between 10 and 15% of the construction cost. So that's going to use a fair amount of the $1 million. But then as soon as we're done with that detailed design, then hopefully we'll be able to either get the FEMA grant and or the state money, and won't have to tap into the $5 million from bond financing for the city, and we'll move ahead with the construction.
So we already know where that's going to be allocated, pretty much.
Yes.
And will that show up on this sheet once the design phase is done? Under the, what'd you say, the 5 million?
So the $5 million we're projecting for next fiscal year, not this coming FY18, but for FY19 to allow us to get the funding for that either through grant or from the state. So it won't be
Or
done
both.
next fiscal year, or both, right? But we're projecting that that'll be ready, FY19 we'll have the funding to move ahead with the design. And
Okay.
again, that just addresses the city dock area. I think Alderman Arnett said we're not addressing sea level rise, and that's true for all the other areas in town. Eastport, some of the other creeks that are getting higher water, we're not addressing any of that yet. This project is just for city dock, to address the sea level rise at city
Mhm.
dock.
So it will stay within city dock as,
Yeah, so the idea is that the first phase will address the flooding through the storm drain system, and then we show another $1 million and then $4 million in FY22 and 23, and that will address the seawall, the elevation
which
of the
number are you
seawall.
talking about?
Still that same one, line 16, if you look out in FY22 and 23,
Uh-huh.
that'll be phase 2 that deals with the elevation, the seawall elevation, so the flooding over the top because of sea level rise.
Okay. Going down to Kingsport Park, number 28. We got a grant from the state. It looks like only 4,000 is encumbered and 210,000 is available?
For construction, that's right.
For
So the
construction.
4,000 is to wrap up the design, and then the 210,000, my understanding is that that's gonna be for the first phase of construction. I think the cost for all the construction, including all the equipment's much higher than that $210,000, but I think this is the first phase.
The committee met and redid, because the intent originally for that park was to design it for the 230,000 or whatever we were supposed to get. But that number changed because it took us so long. And so we were told probably almost a year ago that it has to now be done in phases. So the committee has met, the community has met and scaled it down so that the funding that we had was what we could use to build the park.
Mm-hmm.
So is there something different happening?
Not that I know of, no. I think it's just finishing up the design of that first phase so that they can move into construction.
Construction is supposed to start this spring, so,
Okay, so that may already be finished. I haven't gotten an update since I came back on that
Okay.
project. When I left, they were wrapping up design. I knew that they had a ways to go to finish that up, and then we're gonna go out for construction. So apparently that's been done, and
Okay.
construction will start.
so this 210 is really not available. It's encumbered, because it's gonna pay for the plan that's already been,
It's available to be encumbered. So once there's a contract awarded, then it's encumbered. Until then, it's just money that's available to be contracted for.
okay. Because I thought I heard you say that the monies in that column would be available for other projects, but
No.
no. Okay.
Okay, there's just a couple left. One from Dr. Nash, wayfinding, and I know this hit the debates, the mayoral debates a couple of nights ago about getting people to places in downtown. I don't see anything in out years that I know we have a lot more expenditures that need to be done there. In fact, I think it might be approaching $1 million more, isn't there? Do I have that wrong? But I guess I'm wondering,
Yeah, no, I know that all that was done was the first phase, because none of the electronic signs, none of the signs
Right.
that show how many parking spaces are available, a lot of those more expensive things were not part of the first package. And you've seen, I'm sure, around town, that some of the new signs are up. So it's just a matter of deciding whether the 395,000, I'm not sure if that reflects just the next phase or the entire remaining project, but, yeah, right now that's unfunded.
so, I mean, I don't agree with the thrust of the candidates. I actually think downtown is vital, and the occupancy rate is fairly low, and empty buildings get filled pretty quickly. But still, there is a on the city that it's hard to find parking, and also find things to look at and do. So, I may be making a motion to this committee to put in some kind of money there. I don't know what, not huge, but, something so that we can move forward on the wayfinding.
Let me get back to you on what the sort of logical next step would be in that, and
Okay.
what dollar amount that would be. I'll talk to Sally and get back to you on that.
I'd appreciate that. The Maynard Burgess is also something we talked about. I know Sheila's anxious to get over there. But it seems like it's in a state of suspended animation now between the city and historic Annapolis. It would be a shame. That's an important building, and we did make some investment in it. I know there was discussion, and I think it was with Maryland Live, about getting some money to fix that and put in artifacts from historical African-American artifacts from the early years of the city. I'd hate to see this fall off the radar. And I don't know whether we've heard anything more from HA, or I know Lisa Craig was also working on this. I think she's the one that put in the 100,000, and somebody said, wait a minute, I think HA is coming up with millions to invest from Maryland Live. Do we have any update in the status?
I don't. I mean, where we're at on that project is, when we took over the building, it was literally about to fall down. So the first thing that we did is did structural improvements, changed out a lot of the structural members in there. And then a couple of years after that, we weatherproofed the exterior of the building because rain was just flowing into the building because of the gaps in the siding. So that's all been done. The building is structurally sound now, and it's been weatherproofed, and so what remains to be done is the interior renovations, interior remodeling, because it's still very rough inside.
I'm looking for support, but, we talk about One Annapolis, and we talk about our cultural heritage, and this is an important building, and I just think like we forget it every year. And I'd almost feel like we ought to park some kind of money there. I don't know what other is. I guess that's some grant money that Lisa was. Yeah, well, we're going to borrow it. Yeah.
During the steering committee, if you recall, that I pledged to work on where we're going to find the money to do the interior renovations, and that's what I'll do.
Well, it's right in our laps. We look at it every day as we come to go to work, and it is an important building, and I think really as part of the cachet of coming to Annapolis for everybody is if we could have that be a productive, active building. So, there's two areas, my colleagues on the Finance Committee, that I certainly think we ought to be entertaining. Having been on the squelch everything downside, I think we ought to be thinking about, and I will make a motion when it's appropriate, some money for wayfinding and some money for Maynard Burgess, probably bond-funded money. But I would look to staff to give us a more fleshed-out sense of what the right amount of money and time would be.
Exactly. I mean, and thinking about the way the steering committee has worked is that the projects that made it in went through a process where they changed from where they were as unapproved projects, right, and shrunk down to largely study-driven things, what you could do in 1 year versus 2. It would be helpful on some of these other ones that there's clearly interest from some of our colleagues that what's a real number that you could do in 1 year versus if it was just, I'm not sure whether you look at Russell Street, if that's a multi-year thing, if you were to do it, or there's a study component you could do now. I don't know, but it would be helpful to come back with us, ideally with a number that's smaller. So we could basically be helpful to our colleagues to get something in the budget to move it forward, and then it has some life to it instead of just being a project that gets talked about year in, year out and never gets a dollar put next to it. So I think that's what,
Perhaps,
that would be helpful, David, if you could bring us something on those. That
And Cindy, maybe you could send out an email to all of the alderpersons that the time is drawing nigh, and if you have some thoughts on the, I thought we were gonna close it out today, but I think I'm throwing monkey wrench into that.
I think, I mean,
One more
it's like
call.
everything. I mean, we basically, the last meeting, which, as soon as we're done with this conversation, we can get to talking about the next week and a half, which is basically the end of our meeting schedule here. You know, there's always sort of a drop dead date where if you got an amendment, you bring it and we start voting on it. It could be CIP as well as general budget, which is probably next Thursday. So we have some time for, you know, if there's a way to sort of take some of these projects and squeeze them out and see what the input is from our colleagues. I know Alderman Budge talked to me about the wayfinding and trying to see a little more money put into that specifically, and he's very interested in that. So as much as there are other ones on this list that folks are interested in, we can try and do something on it, at least, you know, get it moving.
I see Maria Broadbent in the audience. I've been focusing on the general fund. Are you here, Maria, about stormwater, or? But Sheila had her hand up.
Sure, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sheila.
May I?
Please.
I guess my question, David, is 900,000 about the going rate to do a one block of sidewalk? Because that's what Russell Street is. It's one block between West Street and Smithville Street.
Yeah, I think we would have to acquire an easement from the Toyota dealership to put a sidewalk there. So I think that was part of the cost, and then the design cost is included in the construction.
Plus it's
So-
front of it, it's parking lot.
It is, yeah.
Like it's, yeah.
It is, it's parking lot. Yeah, that's all pavement on that side of the street.
So would it be two sides of the street or just one
I
side?
think it's just on the, my recall is just on the Toyota side of the
Yeah,
street.
I think you're right. And so it's just an entrance in. They have a few spots there where people park to get their car serviced, but there's an entry into their big lot. So it's not a lot of space even in that one block. So I just wondered whether that was the going rate.
Yeah, because Free State Press is there, and they angle park.
But they're on the other side.
That's right, on the other side,
Side.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
That, what do you call it? The demonstration that's gonna be down at Susan Campbell Park, is that for what? Is that flood mitigation?
So there's three basic phases for flood mitigation. You're gonna get a longer answer than you ever wanted, but that's okay.
Oh,
So there's three parts of flood mitigation. The first part that we're addressing with this money is the water that comes up through the storm drain system. That's 95% of the problem now. So every time we see Compromise and Dock Street flooded, it's water that's coming up through the storm drain. So we're going to address that. The second phase, which is the out years on that same line, is as sea level rise continues, we're going to start getting more flooding over the top of the seawall. So we need to address out in those out years the elevation of the seawall. So we'll be raising the seawall in some way or the other. The third is the storm surge due to hurricanes and other storm events. That's what the demonstration is going to be. Is you just put these out temporarily when you expect a hurricane, and it keeps the storm surge down. So those are just going to be temporary structure, water bladders and these other devices that just are temporarily erected for that purpose.
Thank you, Maria.
Good afternoon, Maria Broadbent, Office of Environmental Policy. I was just here, if you had any questions, we talked a little bit about it in the Environmental Matters and a little bit in Finance Committee the other day, that as the city's requirements for the stormwater management permit come up, we have requested through the budget $1 million to put towards construction of stormwater projects, and, you know, whatever the needs are there. There are some other things that are associated with the permit that we have some needs for, and that would be included in there.
Thank you. Any questions?
Well, I think we also would like, if you can, to come back when we talk about fees, because I think we need to seriously look at the big jump in the stormwater management fee, probably from $10 a quarter to maybe $40 a quarter if we're ever gonna meet our TMDL plan. And that's a rough estimate on my part, if you have a more refined number, but we certainly need to talk about that.
Okay.
The backside of this is full of zeros, essentially, other than the gas mitigation, and, I mean, can't we just throw some Pepto-Bismol on that and be done with it?
I wish we could.
That, gas mitigation and Spa Road, or no, general sidewalks are the only two things. Are there any, I see transportation, Kenny, you're on transportation, are you on transportation?
I am.
So they're talking about a, transportation oil-water separator, and I don't know, transportation plan money and.
Yeah, the transportation oil-water separator was actually funded a couple of years ago. I think that's just being carried forward because it was funded, but it's not complete yet.
Okay.
But it's all zeros because it was funded, I think, 2 years ago.
Hillman Garage is on there.
So we still have money in that CIP to do the repairs that we do from time to time, and have the structural engineer come out every other month to take a look at it. But we definitely are going to have to talk about that in the near future.
That's where we're gonna need some of that band flexibility on our capital budget, because even more eminent than sea level is Hillman Garage, I believe. Harbor Master has some things here.
So let's do this. I'm trying to figure out how to wrestle this. Maybe, Melissa, the email you sent us that had a copy of this, if you want to have, you give that to Cindy, and we'll have Cindy send, if you would, Cindy, to everyone on the council, saying, this is the list that's come forward, been presented to the Finance Committee. Some projects you'll see on here have not been funded. If you have an interest in one of them in particular, please let us know in the next couple days. We'll be considering amendments next week. And my hope is that if anyone comes forward, I think we probably have some people in the room who will come forward on particular projects, David, that if they're in your ballpark, we can go back to you and say, what's a small scale version of this to get it going, and then we can have that to, when we sit down next week to look at amendments, we can do that. So I think that's probably the best way to take this, and that is basically assuming that everything that the work group and the steering committee came up with that is in here, that nobody has any desire to change any of those items. We're just talking about the ones that were on the margin.
Right.
Should any of them be brought back in, and that'll be the discussion next week.
I would also send it to Beth Mock and Archie Trader, because there's a nice fat wish list here on boating amenities, and we are a boating center.
Well, presumably they're the people who put them on that list. I mean,
Well,
they're the ones who brought them forward.
yeah, but
They're both on the working committee.
Yeah. Alderman Finlayson?
How much are you looking to add?
none. No, I mean, we're not trying to invite the floodgates opening, because we just went through a really severe ratcheting down, but I think, I had two thoughts in going through this list. One, I don't feel like you have the same shot at this stuff as I do, and so I wanted to make sure we went over it. But two, if we are going to be able to gain some flexibility out of this, and the interest rates are low right now, maybe this is a prudent time to be putting some money in there. So, obviously, it's put in your thing, and we'll see where we go.
So if all the cards fall in the right direction, then there may be an opportunity to add.
There's always an opportunity to add. Come on, we're politicians.
Okay.
Chicken in every pie.
It is an election year after all.
Yeah. She staffs it.
She runs
I'm
it.
just the administrator. So the
Right.
behind the scenes.
Keeps track of the numbers.
The capital steering committee is Director Gerald, Director Miller, Tom, City Manager Tom Andrews, the chair of the finance committee or his representative, so Alderman Arnett and Alderman Pfeiffer were also there for several meetings.
And the planning.
Director of Planning and Zoning, and the Chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Okay, so if everyone's good with that plan, if we could get that out to people tomorrow or something, give them a couple days so David doesn't have to turn it around at the last possible moment. But I think you have a sense which ones that weren't funded, that there may be some interest in trying to put a small amount of money into just to make them viable. I think that's probably where we're headed. It's just a question of how much. And Bruce, frankly, I mean, if we're going to go down this road of everything we heard today about bans and stuff, I mean, in this current budget, where we're sitting at the moment of what would have to be bond funded, how much wiggle room do we got? Like, those are probably the conversations we'll have next Thursday, probably when we get to actual amendments, so.
So just so we're clear, so the
Sure.
ones I wrote down were wayfinding, Russell Street, Maynard Burgess, and Barbud? Barbud, okay. I said Russell.
Yes.
Yep, wayfinding, Russell, Maynard Burgess, and Barbud.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, unless there's any other questions for the CIP team. So this sort of leads us to our next conversation, which is, with the couple meetings we have left, how to organize them. And Cindy has been sort of working on a list of the items that we've said we want to come back and revisit, as well as what we have to do. And if you look at when we talked about the calendars initially, working back from a week from Monday is the last meeting, the 8th, the report has to be delivered that night. So that meeting on the 8th in the afternoon would be largely, to take what the draft that Nikki does and polish it, basically, and make sure we have everything in it, and hopefully we are not voting on anything that day. We have everything done by Thursday of next week, the 4th, so that can have some time to put that together. It's sort of my hope. So I think we're on for 2 to 4 next Monday, the 1st, and 2 to 4 on Thursday. I think the Thursday session is largely offering any amendments, voting on any amendments. It's sort of the last train leaving the station, right? So we need to basically have that done. The question is what has to happen on Monday, and what issues have we said we want to revisit, so we can talk about where we have to have staff come, or anyone who's have to provide feedback. So help me here, Cindy. We said on Monday's session we wanted to get into legislative review, so actually looking at the ordinances and the resolutions and grants, right? Are we going to make that, when we make that public, is the assumption that the community grants folks, some of them will want to come, and we've done that in the past, or is it going to be the presentation from the committee? We haven't. Yeah. I mean, so their recommendations are done. They're waiting to be invited on Monday to. Good. So on Monday, the committee will be here prepared to make the recommendations and take questions from folks. And as I recall in previous years, then we also see some of the folks who were applicants sort of coming, on the heels of that. But we'll.
Are we talking about grants now, or what?
We can make sure that the full committee is here, so if you have questions on process or...
In as much as they can, I think that's good. But, so first thing on Monday, maybe 2 o'clock, start with the grants and the committee.
Okay.
Does that sound good, everybody? Okay. And then we can get into some of the ordinances. My hope is that on Monday, I think in the past we've had conversations about like the ordinances related to like fees and fines, where we sort of close those out, and then Thursday ends up being more about the operating budget, finishing the CIP, whatever amendments we have. So if anyone is thinking about wanting us to get into particular changes in the operating budget, that's sort of the timeline, is before next Thursday, bringing sort of things forward for us to consider. And actually on Thursday afternoon, really getting into people offering any amendments they might have.
So
Cuts,
in the-
additions, that kind of thing.
Right, so in the
Gotcha.
past, we've had sort of, if you want to add, it's good if you can find a place to subtract.
Sure.
Um, So, and that's certainly what I'm thinking about, a staff person for planning and zoning, and maybe more money for the studies that are long overdue, and possibly a staff person for finance. Sheila, Joe, and I have asked for, although not seen, legislation asking for counsel for the city council as independent from the Office of Law, and also an auditor for the city council, independent of the finance department. Both of those could be contract positions, they might not be full-time positions.
Shame
So-
on you creating a contract position.
Pardon me?
I said, shame on you creating a
Well,
contract.
I know, but I mean, do we really need a full-time auditor?
Right, I understand.
But there are times I'm certainly feeling the pinch where I need some outside help from legal counsel. And I think maybe we just do this in baby steps to get it
Mhm.
started. I will tell you quite honestly that some of the sources of funding those requests are going to come from not doing a budget cut. So that's my thinking at this date. But I would encourage, and I think we should encourage all our colleagues on the council to really start preparing that list.
Absolutely. And we could, I'm sure at Monday's session, spend a little bit of time starting to set the stage for Thursday, but that's, I mean, in as much as amendments need to be squared with the finance department or whichever department, I mean, that's sort of the time to start thinking about that. And as we say every year, I mean, we can make whatever amendments you can get two of us to agree to. Obviously, everyone, even if something's presented or just talked about but not presented but wants to be done at the full council, everyone has the right to do that. So this is just trying to get whatever we can agree to as the finance committee on paper and start that next phase of the process. Alderman Finlayson.
I understand that the small and minority business position has been eliminated. So if we're going to create a list, I would definitely like to add that back to the
I
list.
think Alderman Budge will definitely be in your camp on that. It
And-
hasn't been eliminated, it just hadn't been filled, but I think the director did
I thought the
indicate.
funding was eliminated. Am I wrong?
Funding
No.
that was moved to planning and zoning, right? Is that what was, when
Yeah.
planning and zoning presented? So the question is,
So the position is still there, it's just, it's just vacant.
The position is there, but the proposal is to abolish the position and create a planning position in lieu of it.
Okay, so.
But the money is there.
That's my point. I don't want us to abolish that position. And for the second or third year, I'm going to request that we consider giving the city manager a staff person. And my last question, I know you're going to hide, you can hide, that's okay, because I can say it over and over again. Do we have a list of the recommended monies for the nonprofits? Is there a list that the committee, they're all pointing to you, Nikki, I
yeah,
didn't know.
that's what they're going to present on
So
Monday.
when
right?
will we get that? I'm sorry if you all had this discussion, I didn't hear. Okay, so we'll get it today or tomorrow, whenever, okay. Thank you.
So, with that framework, if that's agreeable to everybody, Cindy, remind me what we have on sort of the parking lot that we said we wanted to revisit that might not fit neatly in those boxes, so we can decide if we want to do it. Thank you. So, debt service ceiling, obviously we had a conversation about that today. I think everyone sort of has a sense that, my guess is that there would be a recommendation to say, we authorize you to do bans going forward or something like that, would in some language probably in the report saying how important it is to deal with the long term. I mean, is that what we're thinking about, what we need?
Yeah, I wanted to,
If
I would
that's the will.
include in your report that you reviewed it and, you know, recommend it as an option.
Okay.
There is fund balance, we had talked off and on about new policies for managing or segmenting the fund balance,
Mhm.
is that on that list? Because that's one of the things that I think we need to also
Okay.
talk about.
So, and this was Alderman Arnett's, I'm just trying to tick these off so we can figure out, prior year savings versus fund balance, that was
Yeah,
your
that's it.
concept, but, so, I
What
guess,
Bruce is working on will take care of that.
so it'll be some language that,
Yeah.
for the report, basically.
Right, Bruce, you're close to
I'm sorry.
you're close to having written up the segmentation
Yes.
of the, and we can talk about if there's a distinction between past year savings and fund balance.
Yeah, that will be all covered.
So before we, so presumably the report that we'll get to look at will have some language in that touches on that as well as the whole debt service ceiling issue. Okay, so that we don't need to spend more time on that. The deferred expenditures,
I think vehicle replacement is.
Oh, yes, right.
Yeah.
So that is part of the capital.
okay.
You know, Chief Stokes makes a very compelling argument on the fire equipment, and I assume the same would be for our public works and other capital equipment, that for the fire equipment, first of all, there's really safety issues. The old stuff doesn't have the airbags and the things to protect our personnel, but also it doesn't have the more fuel efficient and less polluting kinds of things to it. The dump trucks, we have a lot of them that are very, very old. Same thing with other pieces of equipment. I think we did fund in the capital budget the street sweeper. Fred, we do not have a leaf vacuum in the thing, but I get probably at least not as many as you, but I do get a lot of requests for that. I know Director Gerald hates the idea because that equipment breaks down all the time, but so there's deferred expenditures that someday is going to catch up with us. Some of these things just will stop working.
So, are you looking for some particular action in the budget? You want to write something that'll be in the report, pointing to what a problem that is, or is there something tangible?
I think, quite honestly, there's a lot of tangential issues associated. What it comes down to is the pay-go concept. You heard today about the pressure that the plan, the capital plan is putting on the budget vis-a-vis debt service. We have to come up with an alternative strategy to fund ongoing expenditures. I believe you even mentioned that in your comment. So we're going to have to sit down. I don't think that's going to happen between now and the end of the budget, but I think it's one of those
I'm
things
just trying to tick through the things that we said we wanted to revisit. If revisiting this conversation was, we don't agree to do anything, we agree to not do anything particular about it, that's good, it's off the list, so.
Didn't we last year in the budget report give ourselves a list? I haven't even looked at it, but we might want to look at the last year's list, see how much we're repeating it and how much we've forgotten.
So the other two items here, the budget officer position has already been talked about, that I assume there'll be an amendment brought forward. And then the Rec and Parks, the testimony about the equipment, whether we want to try and do a fund or just sort of the actual dollars this year to do that, as well as the latchkey thing that we talked about, trying to figure out what the county was going on. So those will, I'm happy to do amendments on those fronts if we don't have another exit. The only other issue then, if we take these off our parking lot list, is the, I guess, having another conversation about sprinklers in historic districts.
And there was a meeting 2 days ago that I couldn't get to it, but I know Chief Stokes is moving forward. There's not a consensus on that group yet, and I think there's a feeling that this issue isn't right in this year.
In the budget context.
In the budget contest or in the electoral arena.
The discussion has been more of doing it tearing up Main Street twice at once. And while we're rebricking Main Street, that would be the time to do the connection thing as well. That would prolong the project, but it's much easier for Public Works to do it that way than do the connection, water connections, and then come back and do the rebricking. So that's the discussion.
We have extant in code a revolving fund, but I don't think it has, does the sprinkler fund have any money in it?
There's some money in it. We haven't provided new loans for about 4 years now. But that sprinkler loan program needs to be rewritten and expanded. There's not sufficient horsepower, if you will, to do anything.
As I understood, that's the hope that this work group will arrive at a point where there's the buy-in to do that, right? Like,
Right.
but it's just not, in the context of the budget, it's not.
And as far as the,
Sure. Alderman Kirby.
Oh, no, I just thought, I heard what Mr. Andrews said, but my recollection was whenever they re-bricked, that they was gonna have the capacity for everybody to tie into a sprinkler system when they
That-
re-bricked Main Street.
Well,
David
that
Gerald
takes-
said, that we're basically gonna lay all the connections to the
Right.
edge of the street, edge of the sidewalk.
Exactly.
But they gotta pay for it, basically, to get connected to it, right, like, eventually.
But, and that only takes care of Main Street. We've got a whole host of the rest of downtown, not only not sprinkled, but Chief Stokes gave us a number a week or so ago. Most of the buildings are not monitored. They have fire alarms, but they're not connected to a central spot. And that response time, getting that immediately to the fire department through the monitoring can save a heck of a lot of buildings, and certainly a lot of the building that's inflamed. So what Alderman Budge and I have been talking about, and I'm so glad he's not here today because I can take liberties, has been legislation that requires monitoring and sprinkling, but then provides funding either through betterment districts, we've talked about that, or other means to make it feasible. The last time when we had the revolving fund under Ellen Moyer, only Joe Rubino took advantage of it, none of the other people. And I have talked to both of the two of the mayoral candidates about this being an urgent issue. We're overdue. I mean, we will have another fire in the historic district, and it
Speaking
depends
of
upon-
overdue.
I know. It depends upon what we do to make that less of a disaster.
Okay.
Move we adjourn?
Hold on a second. So, yeah, go.
One quick response. As far as the replacement of the Park and Rec, or the pit motor equipment, what we recommended last year, for whatever reason, we weren't able to get it done. But we can use unspent money, let's say in June, end of June, we know what the balance is going to be. We can encumber those monies for a replacement program, if there's those available funds. And typically, there are sufficient funds to buy replacement equipment. You might not get it all done in 1 year.
Sure.
But
No, it's an ongoing.
it's a source of funds that you could use to get there. And I highly recommend doing
Good, yeah, I mean, if you want to work up, sort of an amendment to that effect, that sounds like a good way to come about it when we get to that. Okay, so just to recap, so we basically will meet Monday 2 to 4, starting with the Community Grants Committee, making recommendations, and then start getting into some of the stuff. I mean, I think some of the fees and fine schedule and stuff, I don't think have any changes. We can start to work through them, right? So it should be less controversial. Hopefully we can close out those recommendations and then spend some time in between as people have amendments they want to bring forward, working with the administration, the finance department, public works, and then Thursday is, game day. Anyone who has a particular amendment, bring it forward. We will vote them up or down, and hopefully be done by 2 to 4 on Thursday. If we need more time, I think we just keep going on Thursday till we're done. So then Nikki has time to take all of that and sort of get ready. So Monday we have basically the draft that is ready to be voted on and delivered. Is everyone good with that timeline?
Works for me.
Okay. We have one piece of housekeeping, which is approving the minutes of the last meeting.
Move approval.
Is there a second? All in favor? Aye. Aye.
I did read them, so that wasn't a jerk-knee response, Cindy. I did read them.
I didn't know you could read.
We have a motion?
I move that we adjourn.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
We should keep this group